He is one of the most inspirational and insightful speakers in this industry and thinkers. So the author, recently the author of Here Comes Everybody, please welcome Clay Shirky.
I was recently reminded of some reading I did in college way back deep in the last century about the Industrial Revolution. It was a British historian arguing that the critical technology for the early phase of the Industrial Revolution was gin. Right? The transformation from rural to urban life was so sudden and so wrenching that the only thing society could do to manage was to drink itself into a stupor for a generation. And the stories from that era are amazing. Gin push carts working their way through the streets of London. Right? And it wasn't until society woke up from that collective bender that we actually started to get the institutional structures that we associate with the Industrial Revolution today. Public libraries and museums, education for children, elected leaders, a lot of things we like. Didn't happen until having all of those people together stopped seeming like a crisis and started seeming like an asset. Right? It wasn't until people started thinking of this as a vast civic surplus that they could design for rather than just dissipate that we started to get what we think of now as industrial society. If I had to pick the technology that I thought was critical for the 20th century, the bit of social lubricant without which the wheels would have come off the whole enterprise, I'd say it was the sitcom. Starting with the Second World War, a whole series of things happened. Rising GDP per capita, rising educational attainment, rising life expectancy, and critically, a rising number of people who were working 5-day work weeks. And for the first time, society forced onto an enormous number of citizens the requirement to manage something they'd never had to manage before, which was free time. Right? And what did we do with that free time? Well, mostly we panicked, and we spent it watching TV. Right? And we did that for decades. Right? We watched I Love Lucy, we watched Gilligan's Island, we watched Malcolm in the Middle, we watched Desperate Housewives. Right? Desperate Housewives essentially functioned as a kind of cognitive heat sink, dissipating thinking that might otherwise have built up and caused society to overheat. Right? And it's only now, as we're waking up from that collective bender, that we're starting to see the cognitive surplus as an asset rather than as a crisis. And where we're seeing things being designed to take advantage of that, to deploy that in ways that are more than just piping into some heat sink in everybody's basement. Right? And this hit me in a conversation I had about 2 months ago. As Jen said, I've finished a book called Here Comes Everybody, which has recently come out. I'm not going to talk to you about the book today. You can buy a copy at the O'Reilly booth downstairs or on Amazon. I think you've got Wi-Fi in here. A little superliminal advertising. But this was a conversation I had about the book. I was being interviewed by a TV producer to see whether I should be on their show or not. And she asked me, what are you seeing out there that's interesting? So we were just talking, and I started telling her about the Wikipedia article on Pluto, which is one of the ones I've been tracking over the years. And you may remember that Pluto got kicked out of the Planet Club a couple of years ago. Right? So all of a sudden, there's all of this activity on Wikipedia, right? The talk pages are up, people are editing things, right? And the whole community is sort of in a crisis about how should we characterize this. And a little bit at a time, they move the article, fighting off stage all the while. They move the article from Pluto is the 9th planet to Pluto is an odd-shaped rock with an odd-shaped orbit at the edge of the solar system. So I tell her all this stuff, and I think, okay, we're going to have a conversation about authority or social construction or whatever. That wasn't her question. She heard this story and she shook her head and said, where do people find the time? That was her question. And I just kind of snapped. And I said, no one who works in TV gets to ask that question. Right? You know where the time comes from It comes from the cognitive surplus you've been masking for 50 years. Right. So how big is that surplus? Right. So if you take Wikipedia as a kind of unit, all of Wikipedia, the whole project, every page, every edit, every talk page, every line of code in every language that Wikipedia exists in, that represents something like the accumulation of 100 million hours of human thought. I worked this out with Martin Wattenberg at IBM. It's a back-of-the-envelope calculation, but it's the right order of magnitude, about 100 million hours of thought. Television watching, 200 billion hours in the US alone every year. Put another way, now that we have a unit, 2,000 Wikipedia projects a year spent watching television. Or put still another way, in the US, we spend 100 million hours a weekend watching just the ads. Right. This is a pretty big surplus. And people asking where do they find the time when they're looking at things like Wikipedia don't understand how tiny that entire project is as a carve-out of this asset that's finally being dragged into what Tim calls an architecture of participation. Right. Now, the interesting thing about a surplus like that is that you don't know what to do with it at first. You can't. Hence the gin, hence the sitcoms, right? Because if you knew what to do with a surplus with reference to the existing social institutions, it wouldn't be a surplus, would it? Right? It's precisely when no one has any idea how to deploy something until people start experimenting with it and finding their way through to new ways of using this that the surplus gets integrated. And in the course of that integration, it transforms society. The early phase, the phase I think we're still in, is all special cases. Right? The physics of participation is much more like the physics of weather than it is like the physics of gravity. We know all the forces that combine to make these kinds of